Thanks so much. Ooh, this meeting is being recorded. Thanks, Elizabeth. That's great. Yay. So I'm so happy that the 5 of you who are here were able to find us. It's really, really fun to get to do things in person. We were just talking about that before everyone got here. And it's also really fun to be able to do this hybrid approach. So big thanks to JD for making this possible. And it's really wonderful to get to spend some more time with some more of the ComNet community. I hadn't heard of ComNet until a year ago when they invited me to come to their annual conference and do a workshop. And I was like, is this for real? Like, they sound too good to be true. It's basically like you go to the website, it's like very polished. And then I thought, well, I'm just going to go for it because it sounds great. And I was so blown away just by the ComNet community and the fact that you all, as a network, really are what you say you're about, which is exciting. What was I going to say about myself? I am a radical copy editor. That is my handle. And my whole thing is helping people use words for good, rooted in the truth that language has power. It can be a positive tool. It can be a weapon. It can heal. It can harm. It can oppress. It can liberate. Instead of, the whole listing of your credentials thing that people sometimes do, I'm not going to do that. I want to tell you more about the lineages of my work. I sort of see myself as a conduit for a lot of wisdom that comes from lots of different lineages and hats that I wear. The first of which is that I'm a word nerd, proud word nerd, and I follow in a long tradition of critical thinkers and language shapers, particularly Black women like Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, Barbara Smith, and so many others who have literally changed the world through the power of words. I'm an organizer and an activist. I'm following in a long tradition of fellow white anti-racism organizers and educators like Ann Braden, Kellyanne Foster, Tema Okun, and so many others who've dedicated their lives to being traitors to racism. I'm a faith leader, which is sometimes a surprise. I am a lay Unitarian Universalist minister, and I'm following in a tradition of fellow faith leaders who really saw faith as a revolutionary force. Radical liberationists like Gustavo Gutierrez, Howard Thurman, Pauli Murray, Ibrahim Farajadeh. And I'm a queer and trans person, and I wouldn't be here without generations of people who defied oppressive norms of sexuality and gender, and made it possible for me to live the life that I've been able to live. People like Marsha P. Johnson and Kate Bornstein and Les Feinberg and so many others. And finally, I'm beholden to the Indigenous people that I've learned so much from about resilience and spirit and ancestry, including my dear friend Lynn Young, who died from COVID in 2020. I honor the Pecumtuck Nation, which is the ancestral stewards of the land that I call home in Western Massachusetts. And I also honor the many Native stewards of this unceded land that I'm floating above right now on the 9th floor of this building. I really strive to honor all of these lineages in my work, and my Radical Copy Editor project is where it all comes together for me, which is really fun. As a non-binary person, as a queer and trans person, I had to quite literally speak and write myself into existence in a world that taught me that people like me don't exist. And as a white person who grew up in the deeply racist city of Milwaukee, I am in relationship and in community and family with multiracial, multinational, multi-able / disabled, multilingual community, chosen and given family. And so the core of my work is really all about solidarity across every conceivable line of difference. And I really think words can be a tool for that kind of solidarity. So finally, I come to you as somebody who's been in the nonprofit world, the nonprofit publishing world, and national level social justice and organizing.
Hello, I don't know if everyone is hearing me right now. This is Elizabeth. Let me know in the chat if you can hear me. I am.
Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. We're aware that we're muted. JD has stepped out to welcome people personally, and so Alex isn't in control, and I am waiting for them to give me control. I apologize to everyone.
You're not a host yet. I thought you were the host. Can you
No.
can you unmute them?
No, I can't. Once I asked.
Oh shoot.
And I've asked to unmute, but he's presenting, so I am so sorry. He is on his way back. JD is on his way back, everyone.
Thank you.
Hold tight, my apologies.
You're doing great.
Hang on.
Thank you.
No, Elizabeth, you can't control my screen. That was an accident, I think. If
Yes.
it wasn't.
Alex, can you hear me?
So here's the plan. Hooray. I'm going to talk about 3 frameworks for understanding and using language consciously and anti-oppressively, 3 ways that language causes harm. Did I do something wrong?
I think we're muted.
It doesn't say we are.
Okay.
I was for a second and then
Oh, okay.
strove to unmute.
All right.
Did you miss anything, friends online? Hopefully not.
And are you, see if we can make you full screen or.
I seem to be full screen. I like it this way. This is
Okay.
good. We're good. We're working.
that's how we'll do it.
Working it. Great. Cool. Okay. 4 language practices. I love sets of 3, but I couldn't resist throwing in another one. So 4 language practices that can help counter harm and create mindset shifts, and 3 mindset practices that can help counter harm and create language shifts, because it's an iterative, mutually reinforcing thing. So that's the plan. I am not really able to see the chat box while I'm doing this,
I'll keep my eye.
but JD's keeping an eye on it. So if there's any accessibility needs online, if I somehow manage to mute myself again, please give a holler in the chat and we will make those adjustments. Awesome. Cool. All right, let's get into it, shall we? So not only do words have the power to harm or to heal, but words also create reality. Feminist linguist Julia Penelope once wrote, "When we speak, we exercise the power of language to transform reality." Language doesn't just describe what's real. Through language, we actually reinscribe and dictate what is real. So we can either describe and perpetuate an oppressive status quo, or we can describe and thus help create the world we want to live in. Welcome. So glad you found us. No, you're fine. Glad you're here. I'm also the kind of person who celebrates when people come in late. So let's just get used to that together. So given the power of language in this way, I want to introduce you to 3 key frameworks that I use to think about, talk about, and use language consciously and mindfully. And the first is an editor's basics, standards around grammar, spelling, and style. And as I see it, there are 3 perspectives on what language standards are all about. The first is that they don't matter. If you can't understand me, tough, that's your problem. This is a harmful perspective because without language standards, no one will be able to understand each other, given the fact that something like 1.5 billion people speak this quirky language of ours in so many different places. The second perspective is that language standards exist to mark people as right or wrong, correct or incorrect, educated or uneducated, people who speak English as a first language, people who don't, upper class, lower class, etc. This perspective says there's one objectively best way to speak and write. And ultimately, this perspective is also harmful because most often what's considered most correct aligns with power. It aligns with the way people with the most wealth, status, education, etc. speak and write. And many of the rules of English are actively designed to maintain an oppressive status quo. The third perspective on why language standards is that they help us communicate across lines of difference. This perspective says context matters. If you live in certain countries, you're going to spell the word color with a U, right? If you live in others, you won't. If you speak Black English or what's sometimes called AAVE, you're going to follow a completely unique and utterly correct in that context set of syntax and grammar norms. If you're a lawyer or a biologist or a slam poet, there are like whole vocabularies and unique norms that honestly make no sense in other contexts, right? We all know this to be true to a certain degree, but asking, how can I help as many people as possible understand this is really different than asking, what's the one correct way to say this, right? We might have really strong feelings about whether the word color should have a U in it, whether it's okay to end sentences with prepositions, right? Whether it's okay to use the word they singularly or plurally, but ultimately there is no objectively correct best way to speak and write English because context is everything. The reason I start here, and I always start here, is because I'm an editor, first and foremost, and a writer. And a lot of people think that being an editor is being all about the grammar police, right? And striving to eradicate incorrect language through the cunning use of a red pen. But in reality, being a good editor is about questioning the rules and questioning which ones to apply in which contexts. Am I following AP style or Chicago? Am I writing in British English or Australian or US English, that kind of thing, right? And being a radical editor to me means questioning, where do rules come from? Who do they serve? And who is harmed by these rules? And choosing to apply standards that aid understanding and counteract oppression. Scholar and political activist Angela Davis reminded us that radical, the word radical, actually means grasping things at the roots. Radical politics are based on the idea that social problems must be grasped at the roots. And radical editing is about getting to the root of where rules come from and who they serve and what impact they have, and then making conscious, mindful choices from that place. It doesn't mean I don't like rules. I actually really like rules, but I like to follow the ones that matter, the ones that help us communicate across lines of difference. Okay, that's framework number one. Framework number two is about conscious language. Also, if you're frantically writing things down at home or here, I will make these slides available to you all afterwards, and JD and his amazing friends will send them out afterwards. So just so you know that, please do feel free to scribble things down, but you don't have to in order to maintain this knowledge. Okay, so the second framework is about conscious language. I didn't make up the term conscious language. Karen Yin, I think, did. She's the founder and the person who runs consciousstyleguide.com, which is an amazing resource, super recommend. And it goes by many names: inclusive language, sensitive language, bias-free language, equity language. These are all sorts of terms that get used for this concept of trying to be mindful and responsive to the ways in which oppression can show up in words if we're not being careful about it, and trying to draw the widest possible circle with the words that we use. I don't think it matters too much what we call it, but I love the term conscious language because I think it really speaks to what I'm all about. So there's three perspectives on what conscious language is all about as well. And the first one is that it's about restricting free speech and telling people what they can and can't say. This is a very popular far-right perspective that's used to discredit people who strive to use words for good. And it's sort of rooted in this idea that sticks and stones can break my bones and words can never hurt me, which isn't at all true, right, on any level. The second perspective is that conscious language is about being politically correct, and that if you use language perfectly, you'll never offend anyone. But there's no such thing as perfect language, because context matters here too. Everything depends on context. There is no one perfect way to write and speak. The third perspective on conscious language is that it's about avoiding harm and violence. Because language can be a positive tool or a weapon, we have to use it in ways that care for those who interact with our words. This is really important because both 1 and 2 perspectives say that conscious language is about censorship, right? Either of myself, of other people, etc. But at its best, conscious language is actually about context and care. Being correct and avoiding offense really focuses on me. It focuses on my interests, maintaining my sense of myself as a good person, looking out for my bottom line, or perhaps avoiding bad press. And avoiding harm is really different. That focuses on care for others and taking responsibility for the impact that my words have on other people. So is our goal to avoid getting in trouble or having bad press? Or is our goal to avoid harm and make a positive impact in the world? My invitation is to have that latter goal. Okay, that brings me to my third and favorite and final framework, which is the idea that language is a spectrum from violent to liberatory. Just as there's no such thing as objectively correct language, I believe there's no such thing as objectively neutral language. Language is a vessel for culture. So every time we use it, we're expressing cultural values and norms. Welcome. Oh no, you didn't stay. I thought you brought a friend. Aw, that's so kind. Yay, now there's more life. That's great. Even better. Okay, so language is a vessel for culture. That means that whenever we use words, we are expressing cultural values and norms, whether we're aware of it or not. But because dominant culture loves binaries, there's this myth out there that language is either bad or good. It's either violent or neutral, right? And violent language is really easy to spot because it actively communicates hate, disgust, and intolerance. It's slurs and hate speech, right? And this myth tells us that every other kind of language is neutral and purely descriptive, but actually there's all these other ways that language operates to communicate oppressive cultural norms. So the first of them is coded language. And coded language is what happens when violent language goes underground, right? It consciously or unconsciously communicates prejudice, disdain, and judgment, but in covert ways. Coded language shows up a lot in politics, right? It's the dog whistle. It's phrases like traditional family values that on the face might seem neutral, but those of us who are targeted by this language are really clear what's actually being communicated, right? Unquestioned language makes up the vast majority of language. And unquestioned language is just everyday language that carries cues about who and what is most valuable and quote unquote normal. It's the way stereotypes and expectations and values just get baked into everyday speech in ways most of us never question, like associating the word white with positive concepts and the word black with negative concepts. Minimizing language, that next type, is well-intentioned, but it unconsciously maintains oppressive norms and supports the status quo. Minimizing language is like the backhanded compliment, right? Like, you're so articulate, which communicates that it's a surprise that someone like you might be articulate, right? It's the colorblind approach that denies difference. It's talking about what's fair rather than what's equitable. It's claiming that naming difference is what causes division rather than systems of oppression, right? And then finally, there's liberatory language, which communicates compassion, love, and nonviolence, imbues subjects with agency, and affirms all life. And when I say liberation, I want to be clear that what I mean is freedom from violence. The ultimate goal of liberation is to eradicate all forms of violence. And one way we can do that is through how we use words. So, sorry for the delays on this. Historian and scholar Howard Zinn famously said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." And language is definitely a moving train. There is no perfect, correct, least offensive, neutral language that doesn't support the status quo. That's just the nature of it. Liberation actually requires equity, not neutrality. So neutrality isn't even something that I feel like is particularly worth going for. It requires challenging the status quo, right? So practicing liberation in language means working to actively counter harmful language, harmful norms, and harmful stories. So what do I mean by that? I want to talk next briefly about the stakes. Why bother? Why do we do this? And the power of language to cause harm in some key ways. And I want to give you a heads up that this next section involves me saying out loud and putting on screen some examples of explicitly violent language, particularly about immigrants of color, disabled folks, indigenous peoples, and Jewish folks. So if you don't have the spoons for that, I know it's a little awkward that there aren't that many of us in here, but please feel free to get up and leave. We won't judge, or check out for a few minutes if you're online and come back. That's perfectly fine. So, power of language to cause harm. The first way of the three that I want to talk about is dehumanization. And dehumanization is a specific psychological process that conditions us to think of certain groups as undeserving of basic human rights. And the thing about dehumanization is it's rooted in language. First, what happens is inflammatory language gets used to define and stereotype a target group, and then that group is demonized through propaganda. This has been really clearly documented in the most extreme examples where governments have carried out mass murder against their own citizens, right? Hitler and Stalin described Jews as vermin and poisonous weeds. During the Rwandan genocide, the ruling Hutu party called Tutsis cockroaches and snakes. And the Khmer Rouge called victims of the Cambodian genocide worms and parasites. This slide gives some examples of the rhetoric that has been used by elected officials and mainstream media in this country, the United States, in recent years to talk about immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees from Latin American countries. And you can just feel how when you're constantly barraged by this sort of language, welcome, glad you found us. When you're constantly barraged by this type of language, it actually starts to change the very meaning of the word immigrant in some negative ways, right? Dehumanizing language doesn't always result in outright murder, but it does always condition people to look the other way when people who are targeted by this language suffer. So it's really important to be heads up about that. I'm in the middle of talking about how language causes harm, for those of you who are just joining us.
Kind of a tough slide to walk in.
It is.
Give us a trigger warning, man.
It is, it's gonna get better, I promise. All right, so the second way I want to talk about the power of language to cause harm is pathologizing language, which conditions us to think in purely negative ways about certain groups of people, particularly folks with disabilities and mental health conditions, but also poor folks, LGBTQ folks, drug users, and all sorts of other groups that are stigmatized in mainstream culture. That's the key. So, oh, I lost myself along the way. Went back to the spectrum. Okay. There we go. Okay. So negative, condescending, and stigmatizing language like victim, afflicted by, suffering from, stricken with, impaired by, blah, blah, blah. So many ways. It's completely ingrained in the everyday ways that people talk about folks with stigmatized experiences. And what this language does is it communicates that having that experience is an unavoidably terrible thing, that such folks live lives of perpetual misery, and that they have no agency over their lives, all of which, of course, is not true. Again, being constantly barraged by this sort of language, and we all are, it shapes and changes our perceptions of people. And it can even shape and change our perceptions of ourselves when we internalize these sorts of attitudes. So the third and final way that I want to talk about how language can cause harm is through invisibilizing language, which conditions us to believe that a particular group either doesn't exist or just isn't worthy of note. So this slide shares how some examples of how Indigenous peoples are erased through language and stories in the United States, whether it's sports team mascots, a fairy tale about the origins of this country, or words like powwow and spirit animal that are appropriated and forcibly divorced from their true meanings. All of this accumulates to communicate that Indigenous peoples no longer exist. As a non-binary person myself, I can attest to how hard it is to move through the world, constantly being reminded that despite my own understanding of myself and the fact that people who aren't women or men have existed for millennia, according to mainstream culture, I don't exist. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, both sexes, et cetera, invisibilizing language takes a huge toll on someone's self-concept and makes it almost impossible to advocate for ourselves, which is why it's so important to be heads up about. All right, so that's the bad news. Hopefully everything I just shared shows how conscious language isn't about being correct, right? Unquestioned language and stories can do more than just hurt feelings. They can do more than just offend. That's not the ultimate thing that we need to be concerned about. They can contribute to violence, escalating inequity, and death for the people who are targeted by it. Mohican addiction recovery counselor Don Coya says, if you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. That's why it's so important to center care rather than correctness in our approach to language. The good news is, that's the bad news. The good news is we have the power to create change every time we use words. So I want to lay 4 conscious language practices on you. And these are ways that we can actually use language to do good and avoid harm. You ready? You're like, yes, give me the tips. I want the tips. Okay, tip number 1 is about, my formatting got messed up. Sorry, we had to make these slides go from computer to computer. Hopefully it'll still be legible enough for folks. It's about being appropriately specific. That's tip number 1. So the thing about oppression is the way it works is that it groups people into binaries of folks with the most power and privilege and everyone else. And groups that are granted the most cultural value get to be rendered in detail with lots and lots of representations of them. And folks who are marginalized are grouped in these huge, overly broad categories, which paints them with a single brush in ways that are stereotyping and erase the diversity of experience within those broad categories. So a really key way to use language for good is to consider how to be as appropriately specific as possible when you're talking about pretty much anything, but particularly groups that have been marginalized. For example, if you're referring to author Chimamanda Adichie and you say that she is African rather than Nigerian, that paints an enormous continent with 54 countries in it as if it's a monolithic entity, which is so widespread that there's actually an app that a journalist started at one point that said, Africa is not a country. That's the name of the app. It matters when we can bring that kind of specificity to it. If you're talking about resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline and say that Native Americans fought for their water rights, rather than specifically naming the Standing Rock Sioux, that treats all indigenous peoples as being fundamentally the same. That specificity matters. If you're talking about marriage equality and you say LGBTQ people, that communicates that every bi, trans, queer, lesbian, and gay person is in a same-sex relationship or wants to be. If you're talking about wheelchairings and say people with disabilities, that communicates that disability starts and ends with physical mobility, right? All of this has to do with context and what's most specific in that context that you're in. I don't want anyone to go away from this thinking, Alex says I should say Black Americans instead of people of color, right? No, that's not what this slide is saying. All of the words on this slide are great words in their right context. It's just about how to be as specific as possible for the context that you're in. So I've got a pro tip here. I have a pro tip for all of my little practices here because, oh no, don't show that one yet. I want to continually remind us and reorient us toward what it means to be practicing care rather than correctness, because you can apply a lens of correctness to any of this, and I hope that you won't. But correctness asks, what are the right words to use to refer to a group that I think of as them, right? In this sort of us and them dynamic that we are sort of conditioned into seeing people through. But care asks, who am I actually talking about? What words do they use for themselves? Who would be erased if I used an overly broad term? Sorry about that. So for example, if you think of all people of Spanish or Latin American origin as a monolith, you will obsess over what the right word is for those people, right? Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Latina. I get this a lot. A lot of people are like, I don't know what to call those people. But if you ask, who am I really talking about or to, what is the context? What language makes the most sense and is most caring in that context? That really changes things because we are talking about an enormous group of people when we're saying that, and you may not be talking about that entire group. So that's the kind of thing to pay attention to here. Okay, language practice number 2 is to avoid euphemisms. The thing with euphemisms is they're super insidious, they're super common, and they're super impactful. The thing with euphemisms is that folks tend to use them to describe things that they are uncomfortable talking directly or openly about, like death and sex, which makes sense. But race and class and disability and mental health, it turns out, are deeply uncomfortable topics for for lots of people, particularly white, non-disabled people who've never experienced poverty. So there's lots of euphemisms about these things, these identities and experiences. But the thing is, that not only do euphemisms introduce a lack of clarity, because a lot of people may not actually understand what you're talking about when you use a euphemism for all sorts of different reasons, they also communicate that being Black or Indigenous or poor or disabled is something to talk around rather than talk about directly. So the key here is to say what you mean and don't use vague or cutesy terms for race, class, and disability. There's no such thing as a diverse person. I wish everyone could understand this. And there's actually nothing wrong with the word disability, right? There's also often an attempt to use euphemisms to attempt to talk neutrally about things that aren't neutral, like racism and genocide and oppression and colonization. When words like disadvantaged and at risk and underprivileged are used euphemistically, they erase violence and they put the emphasis on the individual person rather than the systems surrounding that person, right? If you're actually talking about representation, then underrepresented might be a good word. Much like with the previous slide, all of the words on this slide, for the most part, maybe with the exception of, I don't have my least favorite euphemism up here. Handicapable is my least favorite. That one is there's no real good redeeming nature there. But most of the terms on this slide are perfectly fine when they are used in a direct and true manner, as opposed to in a euphemistic manner. So what you really have to do is figure out, am I using this euphemistically or not? What's the subtext here behind what I'm trying to communicate? If I'm talking about, let's say, like, Black women are underrepresented in tenure track positions in my university, sure, that might be technically true, but why? Is it because they've been actively excluded from those positions for decades and decades? Because that matters, right? That's more important of context than just passively talking about the fact that there aren't that many of them. We don't know why. Yes. Do you need something?
Question from online.
Yes.
What is a caring term to replace first world or third world?
That's a great question.
Developing or developed world.
I would love for you to hold on to that question for the conversation, because that's going to be such a good one for us to chat about.
Okay.
Thank you. That's great. Okay. So similarly, just to close out this particular slide, talking about the arrival or presence of colonizers isn't neutral. It's actually an act of erasing violence. And phrases like racially charged or racially motivated are designed to be obscuring. We have to be really conscious about the sort of subtext of language like this. All right, so the pro tip here is that correctness asks, what language is considered most acceptable by the mainstream? And care asks, what language would the people I'm talking about use? What would polite words obscure? A really key thing here is to attend to your own discomfort, particularly if you are white or non-disabled or neurotypical or have never been impacted by poverty. Discomfort, no matter who you are, discomfort is important information. It might be telling us that we're bumping up against a norm of politeness, right? Mainstream social conventions teach us that it's impolite to talk about oppression. Politeness is actually another form of correctness. So when politeness gets in the way of care, we need to ditch politeness. We have to be willing to ditch those sorts of rules. Okay. Practice number 3 is to use humanizing language. I talked about dehumanizing language. A really key way to counter dehumanizing and pathologizing language is to watch out for people being referred to as categories, conditions, or stigmatized experiences. Because what that does is it usually strips away their humanity and reduces them to that one characteristic that lots of people have a single story around, to quote Chimamanda Adichie. I struggled with limiting this slide to just a few examples because they are endless, but I really want to encourage folks to consider what sorts of language like this show up in your particular area, your particular field or work. For example, among health providers, it's really common to refer to people by condition or diagnosis, Like saying, I've got 5 bipolar cases, right? You start to see people only as that condition instead of as a human being with complex needs and experiences. In criminal legal contexts, referring to people with a record as offenders or criminals is super common when we know for a fact that a significant percentage of people who are convicted of crimes are actually innocent. So labeling them with those sorts of labels is doubly awful in that kind of context. And of course, phrases like the poor, the homeless, the elderly are all over the place. These sorts of terms condition us, again, to see people in one-dimensional ways. Again, sorry for the way that the formatting got slightly messed up. That bottom slide actually, I think, said felons, convicts, and offenders, and then the other option was people with a criminal record. And sorry, that got cut off. Okay, the pro tip here, this is really important, is that at this point, I have to warn you about the person first language rule. So a lot of people have learned this rule that you're supposed to put the word person first when you're describing people with stigmatized identities or experiences. And don't get me wrong, it is a great general tip to help people avoid overtly dehumanizing language like paraplegics and the disabled, right? But if you grasp this rule out of a sense of correctness, you will find yourself correcting people about the language they use to describe themselves and getting into arguments about whether people with disabilities is better than disabled people, which is really not helpful. Neither of those is better. If there's a person involved, that's the goal here, right? That's the goal. A caring approach always respects the language that people use for themselves and practices curiosity about differences that exist and what language works best in which contexts. There are really good reasons why some people need you to call them queer and other people need you to not call them queer, right? There are good reasons why some people need you to call them autistic and other people need you to not call them autistic. The only way that we can navigate these sorts of really amazing and beautiful, in my opinion, but challenging as well, nuances is to be coming from a place of care rather than correctness. If you're trying to find, again, if you're trying to find the right word to use to a group that you think of as them, you're going to fall into correctness. And instead, we have to ask, who am I actually talking about? What language do they use? And most importantly, why? Why do they use different language? What difference do those differences make? Okay, final language practice is to counter deficit language. Oh, deficit language. I could do a whole workshop just on deficit language. And I'm actually sure a lot of you could as well, because it's just so rampant and insidious, particularly in philanthropy, nonprofit, and other mission-driven work. We have to be extra heads up about deficit language because these are problem-driven fields where people identify problems that need to be solved or use problems to justify the necessity or urgency of our work, right? All of which makes sense. But deficit thinking all too often turns into framing individuals as problems, right? Or it's another way that folks' agency can be removed or ignored. As before, framing people as inherently suffering, afflicted, stricken, damaged, or deficient makes it really hard to be in touch with the fullness of their humanity. If someone says that they're suffering, that's totally legit, and we should absolutely respect and mirror that language. Like if someone says, I suffer from bipolar disorder, fine, great, don't argue with them about that, okay? But when we say things like, everyone in this country who suffers from bipolar disorder is blah, 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 or there are 52,000 people suffering from bipolar disorder in health, that's total fake stat, but you get the idea, right? When we're talking about this in universal terms, that has an impact, that kind of language matters. Terms like the downtrodden, the impoverished, and the disenfranchised are the epitome of all the practices I've covered so far. They group people in an overly broad way that's often euphemistic, stereotyping, one-dimensional, and deficit-focused. I particularly like pointing out the term at-risk students and troubled youth, because I think it's such a great example of how this operates to sort of shape the entire conversation. Are the students the problem? Are the students the risk? What is the actual risk and trouble involved? What if instead of talking about at-risk students, we talked about schools that were failing to meet the needs? of certain students. That would really change the whole conversation. Labeling individuals in deficit ways communicates that they are solely to blame for the trouble that they're facing or their circumstances. And it also often communicates that intervention is needed on the individual level, rather than considering the role of systemic oppression and the intervention that might be needed on societal or community levels, right? So that has a pretty big impact, potentially. So the pro tip here is it's complicated. That's the pro tip here. Deficit language is really tempting, right? Particularly in philanthropy and mission-driven work, because it can feel motivating. Trans youth are in crisis. They will die without your help. Your money can save them, right? And I'm not saying you should never talk about the real problems that motivate you to create change. But I am saying that a caring, conscious approach avoids negative value judgments, names people's strengths, not just their weaknesses or struggles, and most importantly, doesn't treat human beings as the problem when systemic factors are actually at fault, right? A lot of what's needed when it comes to deficit-based language versus strength-based approaches, or asset framing, in the words of Travian Shorters, those of you who are familiar with him, is balance. It's not about eradicating certain phrases or words or terms from our vocabulary. It's actually about doing the work to seek out and communicate the whole picture, right? Never losing sight of people's agency and power. That's the real key here. And that's the key with a lot of this stuff. So, to recap, conscious language is not a find and replace task, right? It's not a list of good words and bad words. It's a holistic approach that centers care. The words we use affect our mindset. They affect how we perceive and interact with the world around us and the people around us. But our mindset also affects our words. It's an iterative, mutually reinforcing process. So we can't just focus on words. We also have to focus on our mindset. Human rights activist and author Grace Lee Boggs wrote, "Visionary organizing begins by creating the images and stories of the future that help us imagine and create alternatives to the existing system." So with those amazing words in mind, I want to end with 3 mindset practices that can help shift our perspective and thus our language. And the first one is to understand your own view. It's really important to locate yourself. No matter what your work is, no matter what you're doing, it's important to understand the frame that you are bringing with you, because we all are. All of us, our worldview is shaped and really informed on a deep level by our social location, by all of our identities and experiences that are valued or devalued by the cultures that we move through. Race, class, gender, sexuality, age, disability or ability, body size, primary language, geography, nationality, all sorts of things, right? So consider your own areas of discomfort or ignorance, because we all have them, and work to gain comfort and knowledge in those areas from people with lived experience at the topic in hand. It's also really vital to work to understand our biases and our prejudices, because again, we all have them. This is not a personal failing. This is a matter of being human and being raised in a culture that is in which there are lots and lots of biases and prejudices just embedded. And those are going to show up in our language. So we have to really work to understand how that's happening. Who and what do you think of as normal, as best, as right, and why? Because there's a reason. Also check your motivations. Are you motivated by pity, guilt, anger, self-righteousness, entitlement? These sorts of motivations are energizing. And honestly, they are all super understandable responses to injustice, but they aren't sustaining over the long term. And ultimately, they won't get us all free in and of themselves. And as before, when tempted by correctness, reorient yourself toward care. Recognize that what you think of as correct is always informed by who you are and the norms that you've been taught. That's number 1. Number 2 is to practice cultural humility. like I can tell you very personally, as a white person, as somebody who was born and raised in this country, who was college educated, who was raised relatively middle class, I have absolutely been taught and have internalized that US white academic cultural norms are the best, right? And everyone else is either striving for those norms or they should be. But consider the term, for example, this is related to the question that had already come up in the chat, developing countries, right? Countries are categorized based on their relationship to industrialization and capitalism. And the assumption is that the desired trajectory for all countries is this sort of extractive development, rather than, for example, categorizing countries according to the health and well-being of their populations, or perhaps the equity of their political structures. Wouldn't that be awesome if that's how we categorized countries around the world primarily? As cultural anthropologist Wade Davis said, other cultures are not failed attempts at being you. It is vital to recognize that many of us have been taught that they are, right? So we have to recognize that dominant perspectives are considered universal, neutral, and objective, while marginal perspectives are considered other and lesser. And the best way we can do that is to expand our perspectives and work to honor different worldviews and approaches through seeking out and valuing the perspectives of people with marginalized identities and experiences. But we can't really do that if we aren't actively working to disrupt our biases and our prejudices and assumptions about what's normal and best, right? We can't just hire a single person of color or a single trans person or a single disabled person into a low-level admin position, let's be honest, and then fire them when they don't conform or they start actually sharing their wisdom and opinions. We have to make space for the visibility, the voices, and the agency of others. If, for example, we're working to redistribute wealth or resource particular groups or communities, we have to ask them what problems they face and the interventions they think will help. If we speak for rather than with those we seek to support, it doesn't matter what words we use. It really doesn't, because they will communicate that underlying motivation. Finally, when tempted by either or thinking, look for nuances. Good, bad, right, wrong, correct, incorrect, privileged, marginalized. Part of cultural humility is actively building new neural pathways so that it helps us see everyone and everything in 3 dimensions, not just 2. Okay, last practice, but this one's really important. It's about workplace practices. For those of you who are part of workplaces and aren't just itinerant, roving freelancers like me, when I work with book publishers, I often will tell them that conscious language isn't something that you can just attend to at the production stage, right? Or the copy editing, the proofing stage. You can't just write something and then fix the language later, right? But honestly, people expect that from me a lot when they've reached out to me as an editor. In order to fully practice conscious language, you have to integrate it and attend to it at every single stage, not the final stage after all of the words have been written. The very best way to practice care and equity in our language is to have as many perspectives present in the room as possible in the conversation. We've got to have people on our team who honestly speak different languages. And I don't just mean languages other than English, I mean the language of wealthy donors, right? The language of people most impacted by racism, sexism, classism, and ableism. Perhaps the language of the law or of particular justice movements. Perhaps the language of particular geographies or towns or regions or particular groups that we're trying to shift in positive ways. We have to get really good at translation across these different groups that we work with and spaces that we move through. In order to do that, we have to attend to our hiring practices, our workplace norms, and the opportunities that staff have to deepen their knowledge. We have to talk about equity all of the time and deeply engage with what folks bring forward. And we have to develop tools like potentially organizational conscious language guidelines is just one example that can assist everyone in speaking these different languages with care. Finally, we have to take collective responsibility for upholding our organization's values. What happens when someone raises an equity-related concern? Are they ignored? Are they dismissed? Are they fired? This is often how this goes. Having each other's backs can happen in formal ways, like through HR policies, and informal ways, like paying attention to how power can be attended to and lended to each other in creative ways. All right. The late, the great novelist and editor, Toni Morrison, once said, "We die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives." So my greatest hope is to inspire you to do language. Do language with curiosity and playfulness and joy. Do language in ways that create the world that you want to live in. Most importantly, do language with care. Those are my words for you, the talking at you portion of our time together. These are my favorite resources and also where to find me. You can find me at radicalcopyeditor.com. You can find me on Twitter if it continues to exist. I don't know, we'll see. At Zster Alex Kapitan, ZR Alex Kapitan. I have a Patreon page, and you can also email me, alex@radicalcopyeditor.com. I'd love to hear from you. Welcome, new friend. So glad you're here. It's great. You're here just in time for the conversation. It's going to be awesome. Also, just to name a couple of the fave resources I threw up on the other side of the slide. I already mentioned Conscious Style Guide. That's Karen Yin's amazing site. Lots of great resources there, grouped thematically, and she also has a wonderful newsletter that she puts out. If you're the kind of person who really likes glossaries of terms, Diversity Style Guide is a pretty good option. The American Psychological Association has really wonderful inclusive language guidelines that I really recommend. They're really wonderful and comprehensive and caring. I hate recommending anything from the CDC, honestly, but they actually have these really great guiding principles for inclusive communication with regards to health equity that is worth checking out if that's of interest to you. And if you're the kind of person who does things in, human rights, human services, Oxfam's Inclusive Language Guide is also a really solid one. That is a great example of this sort of thing. So those are some good tools and tricks that you might be interested in. I think I can stop sharing. I can, so that maybe I can see the people online. I can. No pressure to turn on your video though. That's perfectly fine. But if you want to, yeah. So I'm gonna go grab a little watery thing because I need some water.
Still.
Oh, still, please. Thank you. And I'm so excited to get to chat about all of this with you. Thanks for dealing with this. Thank you so much. Thanks for dealing with the setup of like half me talking and then half us talking. It works better when we're doing a multi-platform thing like this. So I think do we have a way of dealing with the lack of us being able to hear them online?
I think it's still going to be easier that I just ask the questions.
Perfect.
People who are online, feel free to drop the questions in the chat. People in the room, feel free to just speak up and ask. And since most of us don't know each other, I think it's good to say who you work with and what you do if you care to share that.
Did everybody online just hear what JD just said? Yeah, okay. No, not everybody, a little bit. So what's going to happen is if you have a question online, please put your question in the chat and please share a little more about who you are as well. While you do so, introduce yourself as if you were here with us in the room. And then JD will read your question out or your comment, because this is going to be a conversation. So please contribute to the conversation by using the chat if that's something that you're able to do. And if not, let Elizabeth know and we will figure something else out. Great. Yeah. Okay. Who has a thought or a comment? Yes.
Hey, thank you for this. It's great. My name is Deborah Zubidover. I'm a writer and copywriter myself. I work with my thoughts collaborative this week. Sorry to bring this up, but see like generative AI tools fitting into all of this. Like if we don't, there's this idea that we don't like feed the beast, it won't start generating more inclusive language for other people. What's your take on it?
So the question for people online is about, is it generative AI? Is that the right?
I think so.
G-chat, all of that, chat GP. Oh my God, I don't even know the words. How is all this new AI stuff fitting into this conversation? And honestly, I am not up on the hot takes that people have been putting out about that from my little corner. I have no idea, but I'd love to hear what other people think about that question, whether you're online or in the room. What do you think about AI and how that's going to feed into this? Maybe you have thoughts since you brought it up.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking that people don't, it builds upon what people are putting into it.
Exactly,
And
yeah.
it's already pulling things up from the internet, it's like 2 years old, I think, so at least currently. So if we don't start inputting things to it, the way we wish things to be written, then what is it gonna be producing?
Yeah, that's so
It'll continue
interesting.
to produce non-inclusive language.
Totally. Just to quickly repeat that, like it's pulling from stuff going back probably 2 years. And if we don't give it different language to use, then there are implications of that. Yeah.
It's funny, I'm on the board of an organization that just had a program about AI this morning.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm so glad you're here for this.
And things that they were saying, and I run a lead on Alameda and I work as a consultant, marketing and communications. What they were saying is really about there's something called AI hallucinations, which means AI will present something as fact that might not be true at all. So you can't take anything that AI gives you just on face value. You have to double check it. And then it really also depends on the prompts and the questions and how you're framing those and how far down you drill on that. So you can never just put something into a question into AI, take it what it says and copy and paste it and run with it. You really have to examine it because you're right. There's going to be bias in there just because what it's pulling from is not always going to have that equity lens. But at the same time, that's true of anything from AI. Like we just have to be aware that it might give us bad information. And again, it's only as good as what you put into it as well. So as much as you can provide information to it to help it craft something, the better the results will be. And you always want to double check it and make adjustments as you need.
And we've worked it out with the mic. As long as we speak at this level, they can all hear us. We don't have to repeat.
Perfect.
And Erica Brink, who works in comms for social good, makes a really good point on this. Computers can't care.
Yeah.
The ability to create caring language will likely not be able to keep up with the human ability to do language thoughtfully.
That's beautiful.
So I think that's really a good point. And I just think it was well said, what we put in. I do think I'm not knowledgeable on ChatGPT or the other tools yet. I think I'm gonna retire from communications and never have to learn them. But I think there is the possibility, rather than fearing these tools, I think there's a way to use these tools in a way, like if I were to put all of this into ChatGPT and say, I want to write more like Alex does, I think it can help me to catch, like, where I accidentally said epileptic, like, do you really mean to use that in this context? And so I think there's a way to train it to help us. And I think there's a way, if we don't do anything, it will go to the least common denominator.
Yes. Well said. Well said. Yeah.
Can you address the question about
Yes.
developing world versus developed, first world versus third world? Any thoughts there?
Do you have what the question was?
Yes.
Sorry.
The question was, what are caring terms to replace first world and third world?
Yeah,
I've heard developed and developing, but that doesn't seem very caring either.
right.
And then there was whole chat about, are we really that developed? And there's a lot of chat among the people there, but.
Well, and it's interesting because, again, these are terms that end up being used as euphemisms. I think this is a very good example of what happens when, people try to develop words that are more specific, that mean something in particular. Like when third world started being claimed as a positive self-identity in, I want to say the 80s. So third world obviously comes out of the Cold War when the world was divided into three in particular ways. But then, certain folks started claiming for third world as a point of pride and as a point of identifying with basically people of the global majority, which is the term that a lot of folks are starting to use now, as a point of empowerment. And then you see how the mainstream is like, oh, that's the term we're using now. And then it becomes euphemistic all over again. It gets imbued with the same oppressive story that the sort of empowering reclaiming of third world was trying to fight against. So it turns into what scholar Julia Serrano calls activist merry-go-round when it comes to language, because we're constantly trying to stay ahead of this euphemistic way in which people are putting negative value judgments on particular groups, particular countries, particular experiences. And that can be difficult because of how powerful that mainstream is to tell those stories and how much more power the mainstream has to have more of a platform for those kinds of stories than the people who are on the edges, on the margins of language and culture itself. So when it comes to this particular question, you know, it's a similar sort of thing of it really depends on context. There is no term that is going to work and be carrying in every single context when we're talking about what, like, all the countries that are currently defined imperfectly as quote unquote developing, or, you know, all the other words that have been used for that in the past. Sometimes we're talking about income, we're talking about GDP. So sometimes it makes sense to say low income or high income countries or wealthy countries versus, right? So if we're talking about income, that's the context that in which this matters, then that language can work. If we're talking about region, that doesn't make any sense, right? So if we're talking about region, we need to use slightly different language. If we're talking about a shared experience of colonization, that's a whole different, you know, thing altogether. The term Western often gets used similarly, but we don't have a lot of great ways of talking about this entire rubber band ball that gets wrapped up into the euphemism Western, because it is a euphemism. It hasn't had any geographical meaning for hundreds and hundreds of years. So
Because the world is round.
the world is round, indeed. So, and I think Western came out of literally like the divisions that the Ottoman Empire, like we're talking, I mean, maybe it was the Roman, but it was in that same, it was a long time ago is the point. So,
For us.
so for me, and I'd love to hear what other people think too, that's what matters in those sorts of conversations, is figuring out what am I actually talking about right now? Am I talking about culture? Am I talking about region? Am I talking about wealth? Am I talking about resources? And how can I put different words together to speak to that? Or even if I'm in a position where I feel like I have to use a euphemism, like developing, because I'm speaking to a funder, let's say, and they use that language, and I feel like it's going to help me get the money. That's important. But maybe I can define my term in a way that says, when I say this, this is what I'm talking about. Or maybe it's even a list of countries. Wouldn't that be nice?
Well, and I want to switch to another topic in
Yeah.
a second here. Elizabeth went on to say, I'm specifically thinking of when I say this is a luxury problem, or this is a first world problem,
Yeah.
a third world problem. And I think your concept of what is the context
Yes.
of this, not to completely neuter ourselves that I can never say,
Nope.
this is a luxury problem,
Yeah.
or this is a first world problem, but inherent in that to acknowledge my own privilege
Right.
in
Right.
that situation.
That's right.
Um,
And also, like, when we use that framework of I'm recognizing that this isn't a problem that everyone has, there is a lot of poverty in this country, right? There are a lot of people in this country who are having a very different experience of whatever it is. Like, I can't get on the internet in my hotel. That's not something that we need to go very far to find someone for whom that is a completely
an everyday experience.
irrelevant issue. So I think there's also a way in which we can think about how that framing of first versus third, or developed versus developing, can sometimes contribute to distancing ourselves and creating, like, feeding into a single story about everyone who lives in,
Yeah.
you know, Bangladesh and everyone who lives in the United States, which is just not true. So,
I'll get to Catherine's question in a minute, but I want to be sure people in the room are asking what you have in your mind.
or sharing about this very same topic, because I'm not the only one with wisdom.
Well, I have a question. So you were talking about getting a good understanding of how people talk about themselves and reflecting that.
Mhm.
And in a way, it's like really knowing the audience that you're speaking to, but what if you're trying to speak to a broader audience where they might not have as much of an understanding or knowledge around something, and being able to do that effectively, but obviously not stigmatized, so.
Yeah. Well,
That's actually, I'm gonna let you think from that's
Yeah.
actually beautiful. It mirrors what somebody online is also saying. How do I use the language used by the people we're speaking about in a caring way, but avoiding appropriation? So how do I do what I think is the right thing, but then not appropriate something that's not mine to appropriate?
totally. Yeah, I think both of these questions are great because they do talk about like, what do we do when we're talking across lines of difference? And we have to figure out what makes sense in those, like, because we're trying to be both caring and we're also trying to be clear. We're trying to communicate our meaning in a clear way, clear and caring way. That's the goal, right? And I think the number one thing that I often will encourage folks to think about is how to define your terms. I think, especially as an editor, as somebody who works with a lot of folks in publishing, there's this sense that people are like, we have to have the right phrase, and I have to be an expert. I have to know the right phrase as an editor and counsel others on using the right phrase. And then we have to use the same phrase consistently, because consistency is an important, value in editing for good reasons. But when it comes to stuff like this, it's more important to actually use more words, right? So it's okay to use varying language. And sometimes we explain why we're doing that. We could say, throughout this report, we're going to use autistic people and people with ASD and people on spectrum, and here's why, right? Maybe it's a footnote, maybe it's in running text, maybe it's a sidebar box situation. That's a great thing to do. I love seeing that when people are like, there's a reason why we're using the language that we're using, and we want to tell you about it so that you're not going there, sitting around going, why do they use this language? Or I hate the language they use, and now I don't want to give them money because we don't want that. So that's one option that I think is really important. With regards to the question of like how to not appropriate language, I think that's a really good one, because sometimes we don't necessarily know what a term means within community. We can use much more nuanced language within a community of people who share the same marginalized experience than we can in the mainstream. So, for example, there's going to be tons and tons of language around gender and gender identity that we use within trans communities and non-binary communities. And then when we go and we want to talk to doctors, we're going to use really different language because we have a different set of needs in that situation. And we don't need to be confusing doctors with the amazing degree of nuance that we have when it comes to understanding our genders. So similarly, when it comes to appropriation, it's really important to be clear not only what language do people use for themselves, but where do they use that language? What does that language actually mean to them? What does it communicate? Instead of making assumptions that all of these terms are interchangeable, right? All these different identity terms are interchangeable. For example, there are a lot of words that people will use who are of African descent. They might say, I'm a person of African descent. They might say, I'm Black. They might say, I'm African American. They might say, I'm Caribbean. There are these words mean different things. They may even say, I'm Negro, I'm colored, because they came up at a time when that was the language that was in use, and they still use that language, right? Or it might be because they're from South Africa or a different country where that's the language that is used today. So being like, oh, I don't know whether to say Black or African American or person of African descent, those three terms actually mean different things. So we have to understand what they mean in order. That's where we avoid appropriation, is when we actually know this is what this term means in its right context, and here's where to use it and where not to use it. And the only way we can do that is by being in relationship, right, with the people who use that language and being immersed in it. in various different ways.
I look at it in my experience, my husband and I have 3 children of 3 different races. The 2 youngest we've adopted at birth, so we're the only blended family they've known. But our oldest, Toby, he moved in at 16 and is now 24. And he, at different points, will describe himself as African-American or Black, or among his friends, he'll sometimes use the N-word. I'm like, I can't hear that, I can't do that. And he's like, it's not your world, it's my world.
Right.
And so it's figuring out what's appropriate, where can I step in and use it, and where do I need to step out and say,
Yeah,
here's what I say, but here's how my son says it differently.
right.
So,
And that means we might make mistakes.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like, we have to be okay with having an open, ongoing conversation about this stuff and getting comfortable being uncomfortable, basically, of just like, oh, wow, what does this word mean to you? That's so fascinating. And oh gosh, I used a term and then I wasn't sure if it was the right term. And can we chat about that? You can't ask those kinds of questions of people if you're not in a relationship. You can't just go up to someone on the street and be like, I see you have the word queer on your hat. What does that word mean to you? You know, should I be using that word? Like, this is something that relies on actual connection. Yeah. But I wonder, does anyone else have thoughts on that? Because that's a really important question. Are there any comments in the chat? People are furiously typing. It's complicated.
all the comments in the chat are just very complimentary.
Was there a particular situation that made you bring that up? Like a case study?
Well, I was even thinking, I worked with a client that is a organization that works with people with disabilities, and we had a whole discussion about, because some people say I'm disabled and others, you know, use different terms, and so it just made me, when you were talking about that, I was just thinking about that discussion, and
Yeah,
you know, so many people have different viewpoints that are all valid, but then how, when you're trying to talk to a bigger group,
right.
how do you that work? But I think your
Yeah.
suggestion of just recognizing why you're using a specific phrase or term or whatever, just create some clarity
Totally.
is good.
Yeah, and that's a really good example of a time when mixing it up and saying people with disabilities in some places and disabled people in other places is a perfectly great thing to do, particularly if you then are able to explain why you're doing it. Because that is one of those things that there's a whole cadre of people out there who have made it their mission to get frustrated and angry when people say disabled people. And most of those people aren't disabled, in my experience. Most of them are people who perhaps have a loved one or have worked in education or another sort of, this language was very prevalent and it is very prevalent in like government and education. This idea that you have to put the word person first. And so people are coming from a good place and being like, we have to be humanizing of disabled people, of people with disabilities. But ultimately, they don't realize that that is something that doesn't resonate with a lot of the folks that they're trying to advocate for. So you do have to be mindful of the ways in which that there might be a reaction to the language that you use, and being able to explain why you're doing it is a great way to inoculate against that. So yeah, thanks for that. That's really good. Yeah.
So I have a question. So my name is Agnes and I work at the University of San Francisco. I manage our online community and I kind of straddle a lot of different ways of copywriting. And sometimes I do social media and other times I'm working internally on the platform. And I realize that in some ways this may also be contextual. But my question is, so what are your tips and tricks for being inclusive when you're only limited to say like 110 characters or 50 characters? Like how do you encompass inclusivity when you're when the best word is diversity, but then your demographic like reflects so much more? So like what are some tips and tricks to navigate that, but also bring in like a higher ROI?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's so hard when you're limited that way. It's like writing, was it Mark Twain who said, I don't have time to be brief? Like, it's just so true. And I do think that there are creative ways that you can sort of use the most of your small character count. I think when it's a sort of, you have to make a choice between, do I prioritize this part of my message, like having to use more words over here versus over there. If there's anywhere you can pull space to actually explicate, a wider range of people, that's great. But if you can't, then I think doing it in other places is really important. So if you're linking people, let's say you're doing an event and you can only have this many characters for the title of the event. So you use an acronym, or you use the word diverse, or you find some sort of shorthand that you think will work best in that context. But then the full description of the event, or the web page for the event, or the flyer somewhere else on the flyer says, hey, when we use this language, here's who's invited. We want to make sure you know that you're invited. I mean, that's the thing that I think often comes up for me in the work that I do with folks who are trying to figure out how to navigate this. If they're trying to figure out, how do I help communicate a sense of belonging to people who aren't sure whether they belong, right? And that's the most important time to be clear about the language that we're using. Because if we're saying, like if we say trans, this happens a lot in my world, because I identify as trans, I'm also non-binary. Not everybody who claims both those words, sees overlap between those things. So if I have unlimited characters and I say this event is for trans people, I have to say somewhere what I mean by that. Otherwise, there are going to be people who are like, oh, they're only open to trans men and trans women, because they somehow internalize this idea from our wider culture that trans means a very particular thing, and it's not that. So somewhere I have to say, you are welcome. I want you to come to my party. And you means everyone who has a different kind of experience of gender from what was expected of them based on what a doctor said when they were born. I have to find some way of using words that can help communicate a sense of belonging. So I think getting creative is really important, and being able to do that in a diversity of ways and places, so that people aren't like dependent on, hopefully people aren't dependent on seeing one thing to understand. They're going to look at different things, and that's where you can bring that in. But also cut yourself some slack when you have to use a particular shortened term. Be like, we're doing the best we can. Language isn't perfect. How does that resonate? How does that line up with your experience?
Yeah, that definitely helps. Thank you. Yeah, because I know that I definitely use that. So for example, I'll host our relaunch event for the platform, because we recently did that a couple of months. So I said, welcome to, or come to our event, and then I'll say, like, we have our Black, Latinx, and like our Asian groups that you can participate in, and like other ways to like engage with the university on our event page. So yeah, I definitely tried those tactics.
That's great.
But also really curious to learn more if other people have like how also experienced this as well.
Yeah, anyone else have run into this issue or have tips and tricks for writing short copy about identity?
I try to be as specific, like you're saying, so target the most. Like if you are still trying to incorporate the biggest cut, like who is it most targeted towards, and use that.
That's smart.
Well, we are almost to the end of our time
Oh
here.
no.
Is there anything you'd like to leave us with as a last word before we thank and acknowledge you?
I don't think so. Are there any other questions in the chat that we didn't get to?
No, we got to all of it. They're all sending lots and lots of thank yous. I don't know where I stand to be seen. Do I? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yep.
So, that's it, because nobody needs to see my COVID-19. Thank you all, both in person and online, for being here. For those I didn't get to meet, I'm JD Schramm, relatively new member of ComNet, and very excited to get more active in Northern California. I am, as many of you, a coach and consultant in private practice, but I also teach at USC in their online master's program. A couple of my students are here, even asking questions, and grades are already submitted. And so that's awesome. They're still participating. And I was at Stanford for 13 years at their graduate school of business. So, because we do this on a limited budget, I figured out the best way to get a thank you gift for Alex was to go to my own library. So I have a copy of my book, Communicate with Mastery, as a thank you gift. Do you know how scary it is to hand the radical copy editor something I wrote 3 years ago? Like, oh.
It looks great.
And then, I don't know if you know this book. Thriving in Business is a handbook for LGBTQ strategies for LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs. It was written by 14 of us. I wrote a chapter in here about how to pitch, but there's 13 other chapters by other authors. The reason I want to close with this and mention it is because it was a collective effort. We all put our social media networks together on the same day and said, buy our book. And all on one day, we were able to put 14 social networks together. So this was on Amazon, the 7th book in entrepreneurship for about 6 minutes. It was the 3rd book in LGBTQ studies for like a day and a half. And it created a whole new category called LGBTQ business that the publisher actually took to the Library of Congress and got named as a category.
Wow.
So I'm going to have a copy of that as well.
Thank you so much.
On behalf of all the folks in ComNet and NorCal, the next event that I encourage you to sign up for if you haven't is Stay or Go, your Twitter presence in the era of Elon.
I'm going to go to that.
And it is, I think it is only online, Thursday, May 11th. It was in the same invite that went out for this. So hopefully we will see some of you there. And please help me in acknowledging and thanking Alex. Alex, thank you. We'll make the slides and the video available to folks who couldn't attend, and help yourself to cupcakes on the way out. Can't offer them to the Zoom room, sorry.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to everybody online for coming.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Really appreciate your help today.
These are great. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. I will sign